Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you all very much, everybody, for coming. I'm very pleased this afternoon that we've got three wonderful writers of speculative fiction, fantastic fiction, horror fiction, call it what you will. The genre specifications just zip in and out and change over all the time. So it's great to have three really excellent writers here. Probably what I think is the best thing to do is to ask each writer to introduce themselves first of all and let you know what they do, what the background is, just a little bit, and then we'll go on to the rest of the discussion about Forteana and fiction. So I think we'll start with Natasha, not because she's a lady, but because she's a kickboxer.
Well, yes, I'm clumsy, Nick, but I can punch a hole through a wall, so ask me nice questions.
Good try.
My name is Natasha Mostert, and I'm the author of 5 novels. I usually bring out a novel every second year, but at the moment I'm working behind schedule, so I will not be bringing out a novel next year, sadly. My novels are standalone novels, so they don't follow on each other, but they do have one common denominator. If you pick up one of my books, you will always find this mingling of reality and fantasy, or mysticism, to such a point that I hope at some point you will ask yourself, is this real or is this not? Nothing pleases me more than when I receive messages from readers saying to me, you know, I've read your book, but that part, did you make it up? Or is it real? I've had many lives before I started writing novels, not of the Fortean kind, but it's just that I did many different things. I sold shoes, I worked as an academic, I spent some time in the United States, I was a student at Columbia University, ended up staying, worked as a project coordinator in a public television station, and then 10 years ago I decided that as I had supported my husband financially for 3 years at the beginning of our marriage, the time has come for him to take over and allow me to write my first book. And I wrote my first novel, which is titled The Midnight Side. It's a ghost story, but it's a very modern ghost story. My ghost is a very fast lady. She does things like manipulate the London Stock Exchange. What I do is I work with fairly esoteric concepts, but I make sure to embed them in a very realistic framework. But then before we go on, I do want to say thank you very much for inviting me here today.
You're welcome.
I was tremendously flattered to receive this invitation because it meant that you thought I was cool enough to hang out with Mark and Adam, who are certified in Fortean, whereas I'm just certifiable.
Thank you.
My name is Adam Nevill. I'm a writer of supernatural horror. I have a background in broadcast television and publishing with a few downshifts in between. And I've written a novel called Banquet for the Damned, which is about witchcraft in Scotland. And my latest novel is A Class of 16, which is a novel about psychic terror and expressionist painters and haunted buildings in London.
Hello, my name is Mark Chadbourn. I'm a former national newspaper and magazine journalist. I've been writing fiction for a long time now, and most of my books have got Fortean themes in them, which means they appear as supernatural horror, fantasy, some science fiction, some historical fiction. I'm currently writing Elizabethan Sword and Sorcery. So we have Dr. John Dee and Walsingham's spy network fighting the supernatural threat. When I'm not writing books, I write for BBC One Drama as a school.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so I hope that's given everybody a little bit of background on the writers we didn't already know before. Let's just start a little bit about formative influences that you may have had, which has sort of taken you on this path to writing this specific type of fiction in which obviously, you know, you expand in terms of the imagination, anything is theoretically possible. What sort of influences have you had either in your childhood or your formative years that you think has sort of made you go towards this path of writing this kind of fiction? Natasha?
Well, I'm South African, and I grew up in South Africa. And if you grew up in the African continent, you do look at the world slightly differently. Because in Africa, magic is not a thing apart. It is very much part of your everyday existence. And I was fortunate in that I grew up with a quite remarkable woman. She was my nanny. She was a Zulu woman. And she was a Xhosa. She was an initiate. In other words, she was training to be a witch doctor. And she was in my life for 4 years, from the age of 7 to 11. She certainly sharpened my awareness of things that cannot be easily explained, those synchronicities, coincidences, those things that hint at, those ripples that hint that there's something hiding behind the dusty curtain of everyday living. She used to take me with her to muti shops. Now, muti is the Zulu word for medicine. And these shops you can find everywhere in South Africa. If you go to downtown Johannesburg, Johannesburg is my hometown, you will find them almost every second street corner. And they stock everything from monkey skulls to divine bones to herbs. And fully 67% of South Africans will consult a traditional healer before going to a doctor who was trained in Western medicine. And my grandmother consulted Sangoma for her asthma, and he did her good. But when I was with Agnes, my nanny, I always had this feeling that there's something moving at the periphery of my vision. And if only I can turn my head quickly enough, I can catch it, and it's going to be wonderful. She also introduced me to African mysticism. And in my first book, The Midnight Side, there is a character which is loosely based on Agnes. And then another character who was born in South Africa but moves to London and is killed. She's murdered. And that means she can never go back. Because among certain traditional beliefs in Southern Africa is this idea that reincarnation is possible. And that after many years you can return to your tribe. And in this case, of course, my poor character is in London. She's murdered, it's far away from her, and she doesn't have that option. So she will have to become a spirit of nature, a spirit of a rock or the trees or a cloud. And I found that very poignant. My other big influence was a man with whom I fell very deeply in love when I was 13 years old. He's dead, sadly, but I'm still smitten. I was sitting in a dentist waiting room, and I was 13 years old, and I paged through this magazine. And I read an article about telephone calls from people who are no longer alive. And this article told of Thomas Edison, who became my god. He was a man who knew his way around science, but who had the mind of a witch. He filed more than 1,000 patents in his lifetime, but he was a mystic. His parents were spiritualists, and before he died, he was working on this telephone, which he hoped would connect the living with the dead. And I found all of this fantastic and wonderful. And many years later, when I sat down to write my first book, it starts with a telephone call from a beautiful woman who's no longer alive. So my nanny and Thomas Edison, those were my two great influences.
Two quite striking, different approaches.
For certain.
Yes.
For me, it was I had my dad to thank, or to blame. It's quite a literary influence, I suppose. I was read to quite probably up until I was about 12. And I lived in a house, every wall was lined with books. And, I had Tolkien and Lewis and H.G. Wells read to me. And M.R. James and Blackwood and Mackin, and it was the ghost stories, really, the supernatural fiction that absolutely captivated me as a child. And as I got a little older, I started reading Lovecraft and I suppose reading on my own. And to augment that interest in the supernatural in fiction and the fantastic in fiction, I suppose anything at the time, television, films, Doctor Who in the 70s, the same as a lot of people. I remember being bought an encyclopedia of demonology and witchcraft. I think it was Hamlin or something, but I was about 12, and it was full of these sort of true ghost stories and a great plague section, Peruvian devil people, spontaneous combustion, anything in British television with puppets in it used to terrify me. So there was the kind of literary and cultural influences, and then not dissimilar to Natasha, my family immigrated from Birmingham to New Zealand when I was quite small, which was quite a contrast. We lived in this wonderful national park by the sea, in a subtropical New Zealand bush, which was just this explosion of colour and bird song. And I had a very kind of huckleberry thin childhood and early adolescence. You know, it was caves and spears and fishing, and the kind of borders of my imagination expanded through being in that landscape. So that's pretty much it, really.
Great stuff.
Okay, I come from a very long line of Midlands coal miners, and if you meet them down the pub, you would never find a more pragmatic bunch of people and abusive. But get them on their own, and you'll find out how deeply rooted in the supernatural they are. Being so close to death and disaster all the time, I think gave them a heightened sense of something else in life. My grandfather was trapped in a mine collapse, and he lost half the fingers on one hand, and he used to glorify his telling of how the doctors had to pop his eyes out to wash the coal dust from behind it when I was about 5 years old, so I think that pretty much set me on the path. But he also used to tell me that when he was trapped in the mine collapse, he used to listen to the Tommyknockers knocking on the wall, the spirits of the dead miners on the other side, and that's what kept him going when he was down there. And if you get any of the miners on their own, and they would all talk about the things they'd heard down in the pits underground. So that was my initial interest, and I think that set me off on a long reading of all sorts of Fortean subjects. And this year I found out that one of my greatest one of the people that really set me on this path was John Keel. And I say this because when I read his book that was retitled as The Mothman Prophecies, when I must have been about 11, and I forgot everything about it until I reread it this summer, and I realised that everything he wrote in that book was probably the root of every single piece of fiction I've written ever since, and it must have disappeared into the sludge at the back of my head and churned around there for a long time. I thought I was having lots of original thoughts, so I'm John Keel to thank for every penny I've made from writing, I think.
If we could go on now to talking about specific aspects in either a recent book that you've written, the most recent book, or a book of your choosing in which you've had certain elements in them which obviously people in the audience might sort of identify as Fortean, really. Let's see. We'll go with Natasha.
Well, I wanted to tell you about my latest book, which is titled The Keeper. This is not a very easy book to categorize. When I was promoting this book in the United States, I had an interview on radio, and the interviewer asked me, rather sternly, to sum up this book in one sentence only. And I told her that was going to be very difficult to do, but I will say that it is a book about chi, tattoos, quantum physics, and muscled men. And there was this pause, and she said, "Oh, well, okay, let's talk about the muscled men." So mysticism, the chi and the quantum physics didn't get much of a look in, but yes, we did have a very interesting discussion, although I think some of the listeners who had tuned in to have a literary discussion were slightly baffled by the end of it. I read The Keeper after I read a quotation by the French playwright Mostert, and he said, "We die only once, and for such a long time." And I find this a very chilling idea, this idea that from the moment we are born, we start to decay, that life is really one long, slow death. And at the time that I read that quotation, I also read another book, quite serendipitously, about biophotonic emissions inside the human body. And this is actually not Fortean. This has been established in science. And I never knew this. I never realized that within our DNA are biophotons that are continually emitting. So there's light inside our bodies. And I found this wondrous and poetic and just altogether terrific. And I started doing my obsessive research about it. And I discovered that scientists believe that these biophoton emissions have coherence and that follow natural biological rhythms. But that as we age, the emissions start losing that coherence, and if you're sick, for example, cancer victims, the light emissions are completely scrambled. And the scientists don't understand why this happens, but they just see this as a process of aging. So this made me start to think about an idea for a book, and I came up with the idea for a vampire novel, of all things. I thought to myself, what if we can keep our light emissions stable? Would this not mean that we can stave off old age, that we can stave off ill health, that we can be young and beautiful forever? Now, I hasten to add, this is where the fantasy comes in. As far as I know, no scientist has said that if you keep your energy numbers stable, you're going to live forever. This is what I say. Or rather, this is what my villain says. Because, and we're not going to argue with him because he's a brilliant man, he's a genius, he's sexy as all get out, and completely psychotic, but a gifted man. And he worked out this link between biophoton emissions and eternal life. And the way he figured it is that if he can keep his light topped up by feeding off the light of someone else, then eternal life is within his grasp. So he becomes a killer and starts feeding off the light of his victims. How does he do that? In a very elegant way, which I won't tell you about now because I want you to read my book, and it's part of the mystery. But of course, his killing ways set him in direct confrontation with my heroine, who is a really interesting woman herself. She's a tattoo artist, and she's descended from a long line of keepers, women who through the ages have been warriors and healers. These women practice the secret art of falgun. Now, falgun is a very, very old concept. It goes back long before the time of Christ and Sama Buddha, long before Usui, Mikao, and Reiki, which is actually quite a modern concept. But they're able to tap into universal energy, into chi, make it their own, and then pass it on to someone else through meditation. So it's like a super Reiki. So you notice what I've done. I've taken the old vampire concept and I've given it a modern twist and created a vampire for the 21st century. A man not interested in blood, but in light. And I start out from hard science, biophotonic emissions, and then I marry it to chi, which is really quite a philosophical and quite a mystical concept. Chi goes back, there are acupuncture studies that go back 2,000 years, but chi has actually never been empirically verified inside a Western laboratory. And in the mix, this sounds all very esoteric, but I should also say that this book is set in the world of martial arts. So there are some really kick-ass fight scenes in there, and ladies, some men with, impressive biceps, which has nothing to do with Forteana, but I'm trying to sell my book.
What's not to like?
And I hope that if you do decide to take a look at it, it will use.
Thank you. Adam?
I took a couple of years out in the 90s, and I went and took a master's degree up in Scotland, in St Andrews, which for me was like a writer's retreat. I really wanted to kickstart my writing, write my first novel of supernatural horror, which was also going to be an homage to M.R. James and Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood. And I found, I knew I wanted to base the book on a mythical book that had been written in the 1950s by an author, a fictional author, who had similarities to Aleister Crowley and Colin Wilson, someone who had an extraordinary intelligence and sensitivity and had dedicated a life in search of an unseen world. But I wanted it to be a book that had become out of print, derided, forgotten about, but in the present day was a huge inspiration for one of the characters, my lead character. And when I read Colin Wilson's The Outsider in my early 20s, if there was ever a book I would say changed my life, it certainly changed the way that I saw the world. that was the book. So it was. I wanted to write about a kind of mage-like figure, I suppose, Crowley or Wilson. And when I got to St Andrews, I found that the anthropology section of the library had this terrific kind of occult branch. Lots of books that had been bequeathed to the library by a former rector. Some of them hadn't been taken out since the 70s. And so I embellished this idea with, I did some studies into shamanism in the Amazon and West Africa, Scottish witchcraft and folklore. But the one that really influenced the book, I suppose, in terms of the supernatural element, was a book I found on the Old Hag tradition of Newfoundland, which was a book about night terrors and sleep disturbances, in which a figure would appear in a sleeper's room or even perched on their chest, which is well documented in different cultures. If you think of the famous Fuseli painting with a little sort of imp. So I just had this wealth of secondary reading material about witchcraft, folklore, shamanism. I remember one of the librarians actually asking me, as a postgrad you can have 36 books on your library card, what are you doing at the university? Because I have 36 books out on witchcraft. So that was just, you know, I knew I wanted to write a book about this sort of Colin Wilson figure, and then I found this wonderful section in the library, which really informed the book and I suppose gave it a sense of authenticity, and I could create my own alternative history of Scottish witchcraft and folklore. Apartment 16 is a different kind of book. Again, very much interested in a particular figure from history. I created a character based on William Lewis and Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, I think, in terms of horror, you know, there is no better representation of the horror of the human condition than Francis Bacon's paintings. I mean, there's everything in them. Isolation, pain, torture, despair, perversion. And so I wanted to create, I suppose, and explore the idea that there was a world behind this world that only a painter who had sort of gone to the end of his tether, explored the occult, had an affectation with fascism in the 1930s, was able to glimpse this world behind the world in London, and, you know, was it a reflection of the tormented mind staring back at itself, or had he, through his art, actually glimpsed something that was actually there? So,
Thank you. Mark, and where to start? This is a lot of stuff.
Well, I've written only one non-fiction book, called Testimony, published by Victor Galant's about 10 years ago now. And the kernel of the book came from an article that was in the Independent newspaper about a fellow who lived in the Brecon Beacons in an isolated farmhouse. And he was complaining that his electricity bills were going through the roof. He was getting like a bill for a year for 1 quarter. The electricity company had checked all the feed into the house. They couldn't explain it. They checked the feed from the house to all his appliances. They couldn't explain this draining energy that was going in there. So I thought I might make a magazine feature. There might be something in it. I rang him up and he mumbled, well, must be the ghost, or it could be his son, he's possessed. So, interesting, okay, you don't normally get that response. So the more I spoke to him, he was, shall we say, the family that lived in the house were possibly unreliable witnesses. They were very creative people, they were artistic people, they had a different view of reality to everybody else. So it sounded quite interesting. So I took a couple of weeks down in Brecon Beacons and went to this house called Eel Fanog, which was, it's a farmhouse right in the middle of nowhere, very spooky setting in a little copse of woods. It's got a graveyard in the garden, as most houses do, and a rundown medieval manor there as well. And I started interviewing the family, and he said, well, it all started when the ghost of this old woman used to sit by the cot of our child. nose standing in the doorway. And apparently a lot of apparitions like this happened in the house. Now, if it was just that family, it would have been very easy to dismiss the story. They could be lying, they could be crazy, they could be in it for the money. But I spoke to 24 people in the vicinity who'd all had similar experiences with that house, seen things. Policemen, vet, a couple of vicars, one of whom did an exorcism there. And by the end, I actually felt there was something substantial there. I'm a very pragmatic person. As I said, I'm a former national newspaper journalist. It takes a lot to stop me being cynical. But when I spoke to so many people from so many different walks of life, who'd all had experiences there, then it makes you take a step back and say, well, what is going on? So I wrote a book which was a selection of interviews from all these people, weaving together what happened from when the family first moved in, through various exorcisms, and this Society for Psychical Research went down there in the end, and they cleared the house to the joy of the family living there. And I think it changed my views of a lot of things. It was a very spooky place to be in, very creepy. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to get it at first hand. Because every time I read something and it's filtered through another medium, then I tend to be cynical and dismiss it. But talking to these people face to face, you can't do that.
Thank you. Which I think that leads us quite nicely on to talking about any experiences that you may have had. And Mark has obviously already talked about one experience that he's had to change his perception of things. That, this world that we see here and whatever reality is, maybe there's something else to it, that we're not all simply meat machines that are going to decay in the end. Adam, you had quite an interesting story, I think, that you were, something that affected you quite a lot.
Well, my attitude to the I suppose, the paranormal, supernatural, was always curiosity and fascination, and I suppose a desire to believe, but I had never had any legitimate experiences at all until the late 90s, when I was, after I'd been in Scotland and I'd started writing Banquet for the Damned. I then spent 2 years in Kent in this lovely old house by the Sussex Downs, rented a room there, and I rewrote the book for 2 years. And the premise of the supernatural element in the novel is about night terrors, these very vivid hallucinations, physical, auditory, sensory hallucinations, where the characters in the book suffer from asphasia, and I connect it to witchcraft. And then I found myself one evening, I woke up in my room and I was absolutely convinced someone was standing beside the bed, and in this sort of disorientation of a sudden waking, I sat up and assumed it was my landlord.
As they do.
Well, I should have said, wrong, what are you doing in here? Who else would it be? And I did see a very tall figure, defined by the ambient light coming through the curtains, but impossibly tall. So the head of the figure was kind of stooped just under the ceiling. And I remember sort of pausing, and I looked away and thought, it's a nightmare, you've woken up, it's a residue of a dream. I looked away, I looked back, it was still there. I pinched myself, I was able to speak, and it just stood at the foot of the bed in front of these windows. I couldn't see any features, it was just an outline silhouette. And then it moved with this it was more of a glide, I would say, than a walk, and then turned into the door, which was in shadow. I mean, my heart had nearly stopped by this point, and I leapt out of bed and I slapped the light on. There was nothing there, the bedroom door was shut. And it happened another couple of times. Again, I would wake up convinced someone was standing by the bed, just the presence of someone standing by the bed. And I would see this figure. And I thought, well, you know, I'm writing about night terrors, and I've really gone into the research, and it's a very intensive process, rewriting. I've made myself susceptible to the same thing, that's all it is. And I did ask my, gosh, people are running for the door. I did ask my landlord's girlfriend. I said, you know, my landlord didn't want to talk about it. He was quite uncomfortable with the whole idea of anything supernatural. But I did have a conversation with his girlfriend, and I said, you know, I keep waking up and there's this figure standing in front of the curtains at the end of the bed. You know, I've never seen anything like this before. And she said, just quite nonchalantly, oh, it's Robert's dad. And I sort of thought, you know, explained. She said, well, when he walks through their room, the front of the house, she said he's got two shadows. There's his shadow and another one following him. And then once in the living room, I did actually see a second shadow, which was much taller than his. There's two postscripts to the story. That's how it ended. I moved on. Moved out in a hurry. Moved on. But his father, apparently, it was quite tragic, had committed suicide. He'd lost the farm and he'd committed suicide. And this was the family house that we were living in. And the second one was years later when the book was published, was the amount of readers that wrote to me and said they'd started to have night terrors with a figure appearing beside the bed. So I thought, have I made us susceptible to night terrors, or just aware of something that was there anyway? I like to think the latter.
That's affecting somebody with your writing, definitely. I think, you know, Natasha, one of the things I find that characterises certainly Season of the Witch and the Keeper, there tends to be this balance almost, and this kind of so much conflict between, you know, a scientific approach and a far more sort of supernatural, fantastical approach to things. I mean, is that your view of life, or do you have anything that's, you know...
Well, I wish I could tell a wonderful ghost story. The sad thing is, I'm very open to the possibility of meeting a ghost. My mother sees ghosts regularly. My grandmother did too. But the ability must have skipped a generation, because it has not so far happened to me. If I can meet a ghost, I would like to choose Edgar Allan Poe, if I may. But anyone will do. I haven't had a Fortean experience, but people always ask me, do you believe in magic? And I always say, I believe there's luminosity hiding in the shadow of the mundane. And if that's magic, then I believe in it. You're right, my books do have this kind of duality to them. The thing is, I think we live in a Fortean age. We live in the 21st century, and aren't we lucky? Because I really do believe that this is the age in which reality and fantasy are starting to merge together seamlessly. This is an age in which quantum physics is allowing us tantalizing glimpses into the possibility of viewing remotely, which is a concept I discuss in Season of the Witch, or healing remotely, which lies at the heart of the Keeper. It is an age where, well, since 2007, you can now have an out-of-body experience inside a laboratory setting. You can go to the University College of London, to their Neurology Institute, and there, within the confines of the laboratory, they can help you to leave your body behind and walk through a modified reality. I find that wondrous. I found that very Fortean. So no need to be a shaman any longer. No need to engage in rigorous sadhana and sitting meditation techniques that are going to take you decades, to master. You can just have this now in instant will. This is the age in which we can take control of our dreams and walk through our dreamscapes in full consciousness. If you're not a natural lucid dreamer, you can go to Stanford University in California, and at the sleep laboratory, which was founded by the great Stephen LaBerge, you can go there and they will teach you how. I read recently, there's a great article in the New York Times about this team of researchers at SUNY University in New York, and they're actually working on a drug that you can inject yourself with, and it will delete painful memories of trauma and loss. And this is not going to happen decades from now. This is going to happen within the next decade. Now, whether that's a good thing, I'm not going to go into that. That's, we'll have a discussion about that. But this is wondrous. I feel that these are questions of the dreaming mind, which are becoming questions for the analytic mind. And that fascinates me, and that excites me. So I actually think that by starting from science, I don't take away from the wow factor. I don't take away from that sense of mystery. I actually think I add to it. It's wow, this really can happen. Now, Adam, I have to say, when you talked about the hag sitting on the chest, you see, this is my 114 experience, but I was 8 years old, and I rather think it might have been an overactive imagination. My nanny, who was this Xhosa, told me to lift my bed on bricks. Now, this sounds strange, but if you go into South African homes, you will find this quite often, that the bed is raised on bricks. And the idea is that this puts you out of reach of a malevolent spirit called the Tokolosh. It haunts South Africa. And it is, it is such a common myth or legend, and women especially like to raise their beds because, and I didn't know this at the age of 8, but he has a very big head, very short legs, and a rampant sexual appetite. So you need to raise that bed really high. And when I was 8 years old, so if he can't get to you, he will go and sit in the corner and watch you. Now this I find really, really creepy for someone or something to be watching me while I sleep. And it must have made a tremendous impression on me because I did wake up one night and I thought there was a Tokolosh in the corner, screamed my head off. And that's when my mother lost her sense of humor and just said, out with the bricks, let's get real. But it is interesting that this whole thing about being watched while you sleep has surfaced in 3 of my books. In 3 of my books, my heroine is sleeping while someone is watching her.
Because thinking about the process of how to sort of marshal your imagination when you're writing a novel, and I know there are horror writers, fantasy writers that don't have any kind of necessarily open-mindedness or belief in anything, beyond what we know here. I.e. there is no God, there's nothing except what we see and experience, through our senses. But I just wonder, among the 3 of you, how, if you do feel that way or when you don't feel that way, because you have to be in a state in which you've got to be open-minded in order to come up with the things that you do come up with. Mark?
I don't know. I mean, lots of experiences I've had while I've been writing tell me instinctively that what we see around us isn't all there is. And it's an instinctive thing, and it's something you either feel or not. Colin Wilson in The Occult, which I read when I was about 11 or 12, I think talked about graves when he was writing White Goddess, and the book fell off the shelf and opened at the right place and gave him just the information that he needed for the book he was writing, the research. When you're writing stories and researching them, those kind of things happen all the time to me and to several other writers that I know. Beyond what I would consider to be coincidence. I mean, information that I think I've created, and then I've gone to a location and found it's there. I've never read anything about the place before. Glastonbury Abbey featured in one of my books called World's End.
The Age of Misrule.
That's right, Age of Misrule. And there was a sequence I was writing about a coding pattern on the floor of Glastonbury Abbey. And when I got down there and I was talking to some of the staff working at the Abbey, they said, well, actually, there was a coding pattern on the floor here, but it was all taken up and lost 500 years ago. I've read lots of books in my life, but I've never read that, unless, like the John Keel book, it disappeared into the back of my head, maybe. But there was plenty of occasions where you would turn on location and find things that you thought you created. Right. To me, there feels, when I'm writing, it feels like there's something speaking to me and through me. And I know Stephen King's spoken about writing a story is more like archaeology. You feel that as you chip away at something emerges that's already formed, and it does very much feel like that.
Right. Adam?
I suppose, I mean, my primary reason for writing horror was always really to explore, I suppose, the darker side of our inner lives. It wasn't really to express a set of spiritual beliefs. The medium, the vehicle, was supernatural horror to write about, whether it was despair and loneliness, or my new book out next year is all about surviving in the wilderness and sort of psychic terror in the great outdoors. So I need something like that between my teeth to write and complete a long novel. But as Mark was saying, these kind of strange episodes of synchronicity. I mean, I had that sort of night terror experience during Banquet for the Damned. And with Apartment 16, my first 2 years in London were very, very difficult, and I didn't make it easy for myself. I worked as a night watchman in a grand old building in Knightsbridge, in order to get the headspace and the freedom to write. And,
big tips at Christmas as well, I think you told me once.
That was the next building. So I ended up quite isolated and sleep deprived, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience. But while I was in this building, the idea for Apartment 16 came to me that the greatest painter of the 20th century, who could have been, had lived in the building, and his presence had lingered, and it affects the night watchman, who becomes a great expressionist painter. And my Felix Hessen character, the greatest painter who never was, I modelled on Wyndham Lewis, and also I had him as one of Oswald Mosley's black shirts. And then years later, 2006, when I was researching the Expressionists, Wyndham Lewis, the British Union of Fascists, to add a kind of authenticity to the character, to this sort of villainous painter, reading the biography of Diana Mosley, they lived in that building after the war, after they were released from prison, Brixton Prison. That was one of their London addresses, and I just thought that was very uncanny. That years before I'd had this idea about a British fascist who became a painter, and yet, lo and behold, Public Enemy #1, the 1930s, did actually live in the building where I was living. So you always have to draw things in, don't you? That you.
I wonder if it's partly a matter of the fact that obviously writing a novel is pretty good, which these are. There's an intensity about the process which perhaps pushes your brain into places that ordinarily we don't usually go, and that produces. I mean, it seems no coincidence to me that a lot of writers have got lots of problems, be they alcoholic, be they drug-related, be they psychological. I very rarely read a normal good writer of fiction. I just wonder whether it's that definitely acceptance. So I just wonder whether that actual process itself is something which does take you to places, open things to you that ordinarily we would not necessarily go to. I wonder if that's an experience that you've had at all in reading and writing.
Well, being a writer, writing is not for sissies. You're by yourself. You have no one except your own company. I write 8 to 9 hours a day. Usually it's a pretty grim affair. I'm staring at my computer screen in silent desperation. I snack a lot. I talk to myself in the mirror. When my husband's traveling, I don't even get dressed. So it's not a pretty picture. And if you're staying in your own headspace all the time, then obviously that is going to have an effect. On the other hand, you read chick lit writers, and they seem to be very sane and interested in, shopping. But I think we all, Clive Barker said that writers of fantasy and horror are not writers, they're imaginers. And I think that is that lies at the heart of the whole process. You have to imagine, and as soon as you really start imagining things, then doors open. Whereas, as I say, I don't think someone who writes Bridget Jones's Diary, which I enjoyed, need to imagine that much and need to go to such dark places. On the other hand, if I understand your question correctly, you're saying that some horror writers, they're just writing it to make a good story. It's for play. Well, Look, I have to be honest. I mean, this kind of thing interests me greatly, and I feel quite passionate about it. And in the end, I write to entertain. I do not write to educate. I write thrillers. The pages need to turn. If people pick up my book and they're bored within the first 30 pages, they're going to go to Adam and Mark, and I can't allow that. So, it really needs to move. And do I pick and choose? Absolutely. I may find, I don't know, the mating habits of nocturnal slugs very interesting, but it's not going to make for a great book. So even though I may feel really passionate about that, I'm not going to write a book about it because I'm not going to be able to sell it. So I'm also not a serendipitous writer, and coming back to Stephen King, who I admire, the man has an angel ear for language. But he hurt me very deeply because he said that writers who plot are dullards. And I am a dullard, believe me. I plot to the nth degree. Before I sit down, I will know what's going to happen in every single chapter. I always write my first chapter and my last chapter together so that I can have that kind of integrity and cohesion. And so, yes, for me it is play, but it is serious because this is also how I make my living. But I need to feel passionate about it, and I need to be interested.
Because, I mean, that's in some contrast to one of your recent novels, Mark, All the Silence, which, as a draft, you managed to write very quickly.
Well, I wrote it in 2 months. I mean, I found that...
2 months?
Yeah.
Sir, I take my hat off to you.
I find that sometimes the harder you write, the better I write, and the more I can write, because it is very much a meditative experience. I've talked about this before. If you're writing a book and dipping in and out of it, you're not reaching that level of imagination that truly works. You've got to totally immerse yourself in it. So I tend to shut myself off for long periods and just write for hours and hours and hours and hours. I mean, Alan Moore and Grant Morrison have both spoken at length about the links between writing and magic and creating something from nothing. And you can draw strands back to that degree of it being a meditative experience. I think that you're turning all your faculties inwards.
Is there an experience that you've had where you've written something, you've gone back to it a few days later and you just don't recognise you as the person that had written it?
Well, a lot of the time, yeah. That's what I tell my editor when it's rubbish. Really. It is like that. If you can reach that deep level where the words just flow out of you, and that doesn't happen too often. But it is finding a meditative place where it comes straight from the unconscious, straight onto the screen. Yeah. The story's already formed. You know what you're writing about, but you're not getting in the way of your unconscious when you're actually trying to construct a story. I think, and some of the best writing, I think, tends to come that way.
Yes. I think we've got enough time because we did actually start late. How long have we got, Jim?
5 minutes for questions.
5 minutes for questions tonight. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask?
Well, what writers would you recommend, or even those old children's stories?
Themselves?
Yeah,
What do we read?
Yeah.
We're never honest when you ask that question. We really aren't. I actually tend, I'm very eclectic reader, so I will read everything. I mean, I love Stephen King. I think he's absolutely amazing. But I tend actually to read not in the paranormal genre that widely. Although my favorite writer is Georges Ribaud, who is just a literary magician. I mean, he just writes about magic and philosophy and murder in this beautiful, elusive, and melancholy voice. So if I have writer's block, which happens, he's the writer I'll pick up to just sort of get me out of there. And then I have favorite books. I love Jane Reese's Wild Sargasso Sea. Again, that's just a book that sort of frees my imagination.
If I could nutshell, I suppose, from the canon of supernatural horror, if I was making a recommendation, from the classic period, the late Victorian to the Edwardian era, I'd always say M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen, their short stories, and then more speculative, almost surreal writers from the second half of the 20th century. I always recommend Robert Aickman, Thomas Ligotti, the American writer, and our own Ramsey Campbell, his short stories.
If I'm keeping it to within the genre I write in, then I would say Tim Powers, probably, who wrote a great book about time travel called The Anubis Gates, which is absolutely fantastic about literature and memory and who you are, all tied up in a time travel story. One of the favourites would be Ray Bradbury, whose family influence, and Michael Moorcock, who is still as valuable now as he was in the 60s when he was mapping out the counterculture in a fantasy world.
Time for another one?
Any more questions?
What advice would you give to people trying to write a novel?
Don't.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. What advice?
Yeah, would you give to people trying to write a novel?
It's almost a panel on its...
On its own.
I'd say just make sure you finish the first draft, because the mistake that everybody makes is they keep revising the first 3 chapters and never get to the end. You learn so much by getting to the end of the first book you ever write that, you know, it beats anything else you can any question you can ask any author.
Grow thick skin, persevere. My first book, I had 27 rejections, and some of them were not nice. I remember one editor wrote to me, "Oh please, this is all too woo-woo confusing for me." Her publishing house has now gone bankrupt. Praise God. But really, I mean, you just you know, keep at it. If this is something you do and you can't stop writing, then obviously you're going to write. But it's quite tough out there.
I would say the writing, you know, good writing, it's for me anyway, it's all about rewriting. Don't expect to write a perfect first draft. I mean, some people can. I certainly can't. Write a draft, put it away, go back to it, put it away, go back to it, 4 to 6 week breaks in between. And there will always be some point, I think, in a writer's life when you need a mentor, you need a professional writer, someone with more experience, a good creative writing course. It's why I did the Masters. I got so far and I realised it was my actual work, the actual technical writing, the craft of writing. I need someone to look at it now and to help me. So there's no shame in that, rewriting and finding mentors somewhere along the way.
Thank you very much, everybody.